In a previous segment, I talked about three wars that have been compared with the war in Ukraine that may have had some traction in the early period, but are certainly not applicable anymore. So let's turn to what comparisons we can look at that might be relevant at this point in the war. Um, a lot of it, in my opinion, depends on the amount of material support that Ukraine will receive from the West in general. Um, if there isn't any support, it's really unlikely that Ukraine will be able to sustain conventional war with Russia for obvious reasons. Um, Russia is about 3.5 times the size of Ukraine in terms of population. Its economy is much bigger. Its capacity to produce military weaponry still exists, unlike Ukraine's. Um, it's likely that the war will degenerate into an insurgency. Russia will occupy Ukraine, and an insurgency will follow for several years at least. It's unclear who would win that. And there's a historical example of that happening um, from 1944 roughly to roughly 1948, although some people would say longer, up to 1956 as a matter of fact. Um, uh, uh, there was a Ukrainian resistance to the Soviet Union fought in Ukraine with minor amounts of Western help, specifically from Britain and I think the United States, um, but fairly limited. Um, and ultimately, the Soviet Union did pacify Ukraine. Um, the number of people killed was pretty large. Uh, uh, Almost certainly, at certainly tens of thousands, and possibly hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in this insurgency. Um, as an aside, it is that insurgency that everyone more or less draws on, whether they're aware of it or not, to describe Ukrainians who are fighting Russia as Nazis. So that's one possible direction that the war can take. Um, Related to that, and something that started very early on during this war, um, a massive number, millions of Ukrainians fled to Western countries when the war began last February, in February 2023, 22. Um, some estimates put it at possibly 1/5 of the entire population of Ukraine is currently living as refugees in Europe west of Ukraine. There's a not so well known war um, that has some interesting indications uh, of what could happen in such a circumstance. Um, Back in 1971, I believe, um, there was a war that ultimately became the Bangladesh War of Independence that was fought between India and Pakistan. At the time, Pakistan consisted of, well, Pakistan today as West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. There was an election held early in 1971 in which a majority was government was voted in basically on the support of an ethnic group that was predominant in East Pakistan. The military then took power and began to slaughter the Bengalis, primarily in East Pakistan. This generated a massive outflow of refugees into India, which created a crisis, an economic crisis for India. This led to India beginning to provide military material assistance to Bengali freedom fighters. And this situation continued for months. It became increasingly clear that India was not going to get support to provide for these refugees, and it grew increasingly in favor of intervening to end the violence mainly in East Pakistan. By December, they were actively providing support for the independence movement. And it was clear, probably to everyone, that India was likely to actually send its own forces in to the conflict. Pakistan also recognized this possibility and struck first. It was an attempt to reproduce the events of the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, and Pakistan failed to carry out such a successful decapitation. As a result, India basically attacked and effectively occupied East Pakistan, which in a couple of weeks, and the war came to a swift end. It's possible that something similar could happen in Ukraine. Certainly, if Western Europeans and the United States begin to feel overwhelmed by the refugees, as well as reports of increasing violence against civilians, it may very well be that a consensus develops. And it could very well also be that the frustration with Western support can lead to some kind of first strike against NATO targets by Russia. It's unclear whether or not that would necessarily imply that there'll be an escalation to nuclear use, but it's a possibility. I don't think it's a great possibility, but it certainly is something that well, should be kept in mind, I guess. Um, but the most likely scenario probably is to compare this war, the Ukrainian war, um, with a war that almost everybody probably has forgotten about, which is the war between Iraq and Iran. Now, that war began completely differently. It involved an initial Iraqi invasion of Iran, so very different, but it developed very quickly into a stalemate in which the um, both sides basically struggled uh, to break through the defenses of their opponent. Um, what's interesting about that war is that, by rights, Iran is at least 2 times the size of Iraq in terms of population and economics. There's no likelihood. There was, on a strictly big picture sense, there was no likelihood that Iraq could actually defeat uh, Iran in a long, drawn out attritional war. However, Iraq benefited from pretty substantial Soviet aid. Um, uh, and that is something to consider in terms of what Ukraine is benefiting from. Um, uh, Clearly, Ukraine is much smaller and weaker on its own than Russia. But Ukraine certainly has enough manpower to continue to carry out a war um, as long as necessary. And all it really lacks is the material capability to do so. That means weapons, including heavy weapons, including tanks, and including fighter aircraft and strike aircraft. Economically, NATO dwarfs Russia, and it really wouldn't be hard to keep Ukraine supplied and financed indefinitely. And so you have to, at that point, wonder about, well, how long can this war go on? It probably can't go on forever. And historically speaking, most wars end within a year, and almost all wars end before the third year, before 3 years have passed. Something to think about. That interestingly, the Iran-Iraq war persisted for 8 years, roughly, which is a pretty long conventional war. As a matter of fact, it's probably the longest conventional war fought in the last 100 years at least. World War II didn't last that long. World War I certainly didn't last that long. And those are some of the longest wars. Most wars, it may begin, that begin as a conventional battle, ultimately break down and become insurgencies as one side or another loses coherence. So anyway, that's what I wanted to touch on, and hopefully those are things for you to look into and see what you think.